Picture this, a $200 million superyacht getting torn apart by 180 mph hurricane winds while an 8-year-old girl crawls through flooding engine compartments to save it. I know it sounds impossible, but I watched it happen. I'm Maverick, and 3 years ago, my niece Brinley did something that night that the Coast Guard still talks about. Let me take you back to August 15th, when Hurricane Celeste was just a dot on the weather radar and my sister Cordelia's daughter was spending her summer vacation with me in Key Largo. Brinley was 8 years old, barely 4 feet tall, with wild, curly red hair and this insatiable curiosity about everything floating in our marina. She'd been staying with me for 2 weeks while my sister handled her messy divorce back in Ohio. And honestly, having her around made those long days managing the marina feel like an adventure. Brinley wasn't your typical kid. While other children her age were obsessed with video games, she carried around this beat-up composition notebook, documenting every single detail about the superyachts we maintained. She knew which boat belonged to which billionaire, could identify engine types by their sound, and had somehow memorized the radio call signs of half the vessels in our harbor. The crown jewel of our marina was Serenity, a 350-foot masterpiece owned by tech mogul Harrison Webb. She was worth more than most small countries' GDP, equipped with technology that NASA would envy. The yacht had been docked with us for 6 months while Webb traveled through Asia, leaving behind a skeleton crew of 3 to maintain her systems. Captain Thorne, a weathered sailor who'd been working these waters for 40 years, had taken Brinley under his wing from day one. Something about her genuine fascination with maritime operations reminded him of his own childhood dreams. Every morning, she'd find him on Serenity's deck, and he'd teach her everything from reading weather instruments to understanding emergency protocols. But here's what nobody expected. While we adults were treating her visits as casual entertainment, Brinley was absorbing every lesson like her life depended on it. She'd practice tying knots until her fingers were sore, memorize the locations of emergency equipment, and quiz Captain Thorne about storm procedures until he joked that she knew his own boat better than he did. The morning of August 15th started like any other. Brinley bounded onto Serenity's deck at sunrise, notebook clutched in her small hands, ready for another day of maritime education. The weather forecast mentioned a tropical depression forming near Cuba, but we'd seen dozens of those fizzle out before reaching the Keys. Captain Thorne was running through routine safety checks, and I was reviewing maintenance schedules in my office. None of us realized we were about to face the strongest hurricane to hit South Florida in over a decade. None of us knew that by sunset, this curious little girl would become the only thing standing between a floating palace and complete destruction. Everything changed at 2:47 p.m. I remember the exact time because that's when my weather radio started screaming with emergency alerts that made my blood run cold. Tropical Storm Celeste had exploded into a Category 3 hurricane in just 4 hours, and the National Hurricane Center was frantically updating their models every 20 minutes as she continued to strengthen. "This is not a normal storm pattern," the meteorologist's voice crackled through the static. "Hurricane Celeste has undergone rapid intensification and is now tracking directly toward the Florida Keys. All residents and vessel operators should begin immediate evacuation procedures." I was reviewing supply invoices in my office when the first alert came through, but the urgency in the broadcaster's voice made me drop everything and run to find Brinley. She was exactly where I expected her to be, sitting cross-legged on Serenity's forward deck with Captain Thorne, both of them studying her notebook while sharing a bag of pretzels. "We need to start moving people out," I called up to them. "Storm's getting serious." Captain Thorne squinted at the horizon, where dark clouds were beginning to build like an approaching mountain range. "How serious are we talking?" "Category 3 and climbing. Winds at 125 mph and rising." I watched the color drain from Thorne's weathered face. In 40 years of sailing, he'd weathered plenty of storms, but he'd never tried to ride out a major hurricane while responsible for $250 million worth of floating real estate. Within an hour, Paradise Harbor transformed from a peaceful sanctuary into controlled chaos. Yacht owners who'd never moved faster than a golf cart pace were suddenly sprinting down docks, shouting orders at crews scrambling to prepare vessels for emergency departure. Smaller boats were being hauled out of the water entirely, while larger vessels fired up their engines for the race to safer harbors. But Serenity had a problem. Her main engines, which hadn't been started in 3 weeks, refused to turn over. Webb's maintenance crew tried everything they knew, but the sophisticated German engineering that made her so advanced also made her incredibly complex to troubleshoot under pressure. The fuel injection system's throwing error codes, Chief Engineer Rodriguez explained, sweat beading on his forehead despite the air conditioning. We need specialized diagnostic equipment that's back at the main shipyard in Miami. By 4 p.m., Hurricane Celeste had reached Category 4 status with sustained winds of 150 mph. The storm was moving faster than anyone predicted, and evacuation windows were rapidly closing. Webb's crew made the devastating decision that every marina worker dreads. They were abandoning ship. "I'm sorry, Maverick," Rodriguez said, his voice heavy with guilt. "We can't risk our lives for a boat, even one worth $200 million. The insurance company will understand." But the insurance situation was far more complicated than Rodriguez realized. Serenity's policy required human oversight during major storm events. If the yacht was completely abandoned, Webb would lose coverage on everything. More critically, if her anchor systems failed without anyone aboard to monitor them, she'd become a 350-foot battering ram that could destroy half our marina and potentially kill people in the evacuation shelters along the shoreline. As if the universe wanted to make things worse, Captain Thorne collapsed on the dock at 5:30 p.m. The stress and heat had triggered a massive heart attack, and paramedics rushed him to Key Largo Medical Center just as the first outer bands of the hurricane began lashing our harbor. "What's happening to Captain Thorne?" Brinley asked, watching the ambulance disappear with tears streaming down her face. "He's going to be okay," I lied because I honestly didn't know. "But right now, we need to focus on getting you somewhere safe." The evacuation buses were loading their final passengers when I tried to get Brinley aboard. She planted her feet and refused to move, clutching her notebook against her chest like armor. "We can't leave Serenity," she said, her voice steady despite the tears. "Captain Thorne said a good sailor never abandons their ship. What if her anchors break? What if she hurts other boats?" "Brinley, honey, there's nothing we can do. The engines won't start and there's no crew left to help." She opened her notebook and showed me pages of detailed diagrams and procedures she'd copied from Captain Thorne's lessons. "But I know how the emergency systems work. Captain Thorne made me practice the radio calls. I know where all the manual overrides are located." The wind was already picking up, making the boat hulls creak and groan against their dock lines. Weather reports now showed Celeste strengthening to Category 5, with landfall expected in less than 6 hours. Every rational part of my brain screamed that getting an 8-year-old to safety was the only priority that mattered. But as I looked at Brinley's notebook, filled with technical details most adults couldn't comprehend, I realized she might actually understand Serenity's systems better than anyone else currently available. Her small size meant she could access maintenance areas that larger crew members struggled to reach. Her obsessive attention to detail meant she'd memorized procedures that others only knew casually. The last evacuation bus was preparing to leave when my radio crackled with an urgent message from the harbor master. "All marina personnel, this is your final boarding call. Hurricane Celeste is now Category 5 with sustained winds of 180 mph. Estimated time to landfall, 4 hours and 37 minutes. I stared at Serenity, then at Brinley, then at the notebook in her hands. Every safety protocol I'd ever learned told me to get this child as far from the water as possible. But every instinct I'd developed as a marina manager told me that if we abandoned Serenity completely, we weren't just risking one yacht. We were risking everything and everyone in her path. "Brinley," I said, kneeling down to meet her eyes, "if we stay, this becomes very dangerous. Are you absolutely certain you remember everything Captain Thorne taught you?" She nodded with the solemn determination of someone far older than her 8 years. "I remember all of it, Uncle Maverick, every single lesson." The decision I made in that moment goes against everything they teach you about emergency management, child safety, and common sense. But sometimes common sense doesn't account for extraordinary circumstances or exceptional people, even when those people happen to be 8 years old. The moment I made the decision to stay aboard Serenity with Brinley, the world seemed to shift into hyperfocus. We had exactly 3 hours and 42 minutes before Hurricane Celeste made landfall, and every second counted. The last evacuation bus disappeared down the coastal highway as we climbed aboard the superyacht, carrying emergency supplies and Brinley's precious notebook like it was our battle plan. "First thing we do is establish communication," I told Brinley, trying to keep my voice steady despite the growing wind. "Captain Thorne always said that in an emergency, communication saves lives." Brinley nodded seriously and pulled out a folded paper from her notebook. "I copied all the emergency radio frequencies. Coast Guard is channel 16, but Captain Thorne said channel 22 Alpha is better for longer conversations. Marine weather is on 162.55 megahertz. I stared at her in amazement. Most adults couldn't recite radio frequencies from memory, but this 8-year-old had them written down in neat, careful handwriting with detailed notes about when to use each one. Our first priority was testing Serenity's storm protocols. The yacht's designers had built her to survive anything nature could throw at her, but those systems required human oversight to function properly. Automated systems could handle routine operations, but a Category 5 hurricane was far from routine. "Show me what Captain Thorne taught you about the emergency procedures," I said as we made our way to the bridge. Brinley opened her notebook to a section labeled Storm Emergency Steps and began reading in a clear, confident voice. "Step 1, secure all loose items and activate magnetic locks on furniture. Step 2, test bilge pumps and backup power systems. Step 3, verify anchor chain tension and prepare secondary anchor deployment. Step 4, establish communication with Coast Guard and Harbor Master. Step 5, monitor weather radar and adjust heading if necessary using emergency thrusters." Each item on her list represented hours of training that Captain Thorne had given her, treating her questions with the same seriousness he'd show a professional crew member. As we worked through the checklist, I realized she understood the yacht's systems better than some of the maintenance crew who'd been working on her for months. The real challenge came when we needed to access the manual override controls for the ballast system. Serenity's stability in rough seas depended on her ability to adjust her weight distribution by pumping water between various tanks throughout the hull. The automated system could handle normal conditions, but hurricane-force waves required constant human adjustment. "The manual controls are in the lower engine compartment," Brinley explained, flipping to a hand-drawn diagram in her notebook. "But Captain Thorne said they're in a really tight space behind the auxiliary generator. Most grown-ups can't fit through the access panel." She was absolutely right. The German engineers who designed Serenity had prioritized efficiency over accessibility in many areas, assuming that most maintenance would be handled by automated systems. The manual ballast controls were located in a cramped space that would be nearly impossible for an adult to navigate, especially in rough conditions. "I can fit through there," Brinley said matter-of-factly. "Captain Thorne showed me exactly where everything is located. He made me practice finding all the switches with my eyes closed." As the wind continued to build, we spent the next hour running through emergency procedures like we were preparing for the most important test of our lives. Brinley memorized the locations of every emergency shutoff valve, backup power switch, and manual override control. I taught her how to interpret the weather radar displays and recognize dangerous wave patterns. The turning point came when we established radio contact with the Coast Guard station at Islamorada. The dispatcher's voice crackled through the storm static with obvious concern when I explained our situation. "Marina Base, this is Coast Guard Station Islamorada. Did you say you have a miner aboard that vessel? We strongly advise immediate evacuation by helicopter." "Negative, Coast Guard. Weather conditions are beyond helicopter safety margins, and we have a critical situation here. The vessel Serenity requires manual oversight to prevent anchor failure and potential marina destruction." There was a long pause before the dispatcher responded. "Marina Base, we understand your situation. We'll maintain radio contact throughout the storm. What are your current conditions?" Brinley stepped up to the radio microphone with surprising confidence. "Coast Guard, this is Serenity. Wind speed is currently 45 knots and building. All emergency systems are operational. We have adequate supplies for 12 hours. First Mate Brinley reporting all stations secure." I watched in amazement as she delivered the report with perfect radio protocol, using terminology she'd learned from Captain Thorne's patient instruction. The Coast Guard dispatcher seemed equally surprised to hear such a professional report from someone with such a young voice. "Serenity, this is Coast Guard Station Islamorada. We copy your report, First Mate Brinley. We'll check in with you every 30 minutes. Stay safe out there." As we finished our preparations, Brinley surprised me with one final revelation. She pulled out a small marine radio from her backpack, the kind used for short-range communication between boats. "I've been talking to Captain Thorne at the hospital," she admitted sheepishly. "He gave me this radio yesterday and taught me the hospital's frequency. He said emergencies are when you need your captain the most." She keyed the microphone and spoke softly. "Captain Thorne, this is First Mate Brinley. We're ready for the storm. All systems are secured just like you taught me." The response came through clearly despite the growing interference. "Copy that, First Mate. Remember everything we practiced. Trust your training, trust your instincts, and take care of your uncle. I'll be monitoring this frequency all night." With Captain Thorne's voice providing guidance and Brinley's detailed preparation giving us a fighting chance, we sealed ourselves inside Serenity's bridge and prepared to face Hurricane Celeste. The wind was already howling at 60 knots. The first waves were beginning to crash over the dock, and we were committed to riding out the storm of the century aboard a floating palace that was about to become our lifeboat. Hurricane Celeste hit Paradise Harbor at 11:47 p.m. with the fury of an angry god. The first massive wave that crashed over Serenity's bow was 42 feet tall, and I knew because Brinley was calmly reading the measurements from the radar display while I fought to keep my footing on the bridge. "Uncle Maverick, the wind gauge just hit 185 mph, she reported, her small voice steady despite the yacht pitching and rolling like a carnival ride. "Captain Thorne said anything over 180 means we're in the eye wall." The sound was indescribable. Imagine standing inside a jet engine while someone throws bowling balls at the walls, and you're maybe halfway to understanding what we experienced. Serenity groaned and creaked as waves larger than buildings slammed into her hull, testing every weld and rivet the German shipbuilders had installed. For the first 2 hours, everything went according to plan. Brinley monitored the ballast system controls while I managed steering and communication. The yacht's automated systems were performing beautifully, adjusting to each massive wave with mechanical precision. We started to believe we might actually survive this nightmare. Then at 1:23 a.m., everything went wrong at once. The first indication of trouble came from a grinding sound deep in the hull, like enormous metal teeth chewing through steel cables. Serenity's primary anchor chain, rated to hold a battleship, was stretching beyond its design limits as the hurricane tried to drag us toward the rocky shoreline. "The anchor's dragging," I shouted over the wind, watching our GPS position slowly drift toward disaster. "We're moving toward the breakwater." Brinley checked her notebook and immediately understood the implications. "If we hit the rocks, we'll punch holes in the hull, then we'll sink and crash into the marina." The automated anchor system tried to compensate by releasing more chain, but that only made things worse. With more slack, Serenity began swinging in wider arcs, putting even greater stress on the anchor point. The grinding sound grew louder and more ominous. That's when the second disaster struck. A massive wave, easily 60 feet tall, crashed over the yacht's stern and knocked out our primary electrical system. Emergency lighting kicked in, but half of our automated systems went offline, including the ballast controls that were keeping us stable. "We need to get to the manual overrides," I told Brinley, but even as I said it, I knew there was a problem. The access passage to the lower engine compartment was flooding. Water was pouring through damaged seals faster than the bilge pumps could handle it. "I can swim through it," Brinley said, already strapping on her life jacket. "The water's only 3 feet deep down there, and I know exactly where to go." Before I could stop her, she grabbed a waterproof flashlight and disappeared down the companionway toward the flooded engine compartment. Through the intercom system, I could hear her splashing through the dark water, following the mental map Captain Thorne had drilled into her memory. "Found the ballast controls," her voice crackled through the speaker. "Captain Thorne, can you hear me? I'm at the manual override panel just like you showed me." Captain Thorne's voice came through her personal radio, amazingly clear despite the storm. "I'm here, First Mate. Remember what we practiced. The red switches control the forward ballast tanks, blue switches are for aft tanks. You need to balance the water load as each wave hits." What happened next still gives me chills 3 years later. While I fought to maintain our position using the emergency thrusters, Brinley spent the next hour crawling through flooded passages, manually adjusting ballast controls based on Captain Thorne's guidance and her own understanding of the yacht's behavior. She was reading wave patterns like a seasoned sailor, anticipating each impact and preparing the yacht's response. "Big wave coming from starboard," she'd report, adjusting forward tanks to raise the bow. "Wave passing under us now, leveling all tanks for the next impact." At 3:15 a.m., with both of us exhausted and the storm showing no signs of weakening, our worst fear became reality. The anchor chain finally snapped with a sound like a gunshot, and Serenity began drifting rapidly toward the jagged rocks that marked the harbor entrance. But Brinley had anticipated this moment. Following procedures Captain Thorne had made her memorize, she had already prepared the yacht's emergency positioning system. Using a combination of bow thrusters, stern thrusters, and perfectly timed ballast adjustments, she helped me hold our position just 200 yards from disaster. "Coast Guard, this is Serenity," she reported calmly into the radio. "Primary anchor has failed, but we have achieved stable positioning using emergency thrusters. We are maintaining safe distance from shore obstacles." The Coast Guard dispatcher's voice betrayed his amazement. "Serenity, we show you holding position in Category 5 conditions. That's remarkable seamanship." "Thank you, Coast Guard," Brinley replied with professional pride. "Captain Thorne taught me that good preparation makes impossible things possible." As dawn approached and Hurricane Celeste finally began to weaken, Serenity remained exactly where Brinley's skill had positioned her, undamaged and upright. The $200 million superyacht had survived the storm of the century thanks to an 8-year-old girl who refused to give up when everyone else had lost hope. When the first rescue boat reached us 6 hours later, they found Brinley asleep in the captain's chair, her notebook still clutched in her hands, while Serenity rode the calming swells like the floating palace she was designed to be. The first thing I remember about dawn after Hurricane Celeste was the silence. After 8 hours of wind that sounded like freight trains and waves that crashed like artillery shells, the sudden calm felt almost supernatural. Serenity floated peacefully in waters that looked like polished glass, surrounded by debris that told the story of one of the most powerful storms ever to hit the Florida Keys. Brinley woke up when the Coast Guard rescue boat pulled alongside us at 7:23 a.m. She stretched, yawned, and immediately checked her notebook to make sure it had survived the night. Her first words weren't about the storm or our survival, but about Captain Thorne. "Can we call the hospital and tell Captain Thorne we're okay?" she asked, as if we'd just finished a routine sailing lesson instead of battling a Category 5 hurricane. The Coast Guard crew that boarded Serenity couldn't believe what they found. Chief Petty Officer Martinez, a 20-year veteran of maritime rescue operations, walked through the yacht shaking his head in amazement. Every system was functioning normally, the hull showed no significant damage, and all emergency equipment was properly secured. "I've seen experienced crews lose million-dollar vessels in storms half this strong," he told me quietly. "What you two accomplished last night defies everything I know about seamanship." But the real shock came 3 days later when Harrison Webb arrived from Singapore. The tech billionaire had chartered a private jet the moment he learned about the hurricane, expecting to find his prized superyacht either destroyed or severely damaged. Instead, he found Serenity in better condition than some boats that had never seen a storm. Webb insisted on meeting Brinley personally, and their conversation became the stuff of marina legend. He sat across from her in the yacht's main salon, this powerful businessman worth billions of dollars, listening intently as an 8-year-old girl explained how she'd saved his floating palace. "You understood systems that my own engineers struggle with," he told her. "How did you learn so much about maritime operations?" "Captain Thorne taught me that boats are like people," Brinley explained, her notebook open between them. "If you pay attention to how they feel and what they need, they'll take care of you when things get scary." Webb was so impressed that he did something unprecedented in his business career. He established the Brinley Maritime Education Foundation, a scholarship program designed to teach young people about marine engineering and seamanship. The foundation's first recipient was, naturally, Brinley herself, along with a guarantee that her education would be fully funded through graduate school. The story might have ended there, but Captain Thorne had other ideas. When he was finally released from the hospital 2 weeks later, his first stop was our marina. He found Brinley exactly where he expected her, sitting on Serenity's deck with her notebook, documenting everything she'd learned during the hurricane. "First Mate Brinley," he said, using her honorary title with obvious pride, "I believe it's time for a promotion." He presented her with an official captain's hat, sized perfectly for her head, along with a marine radio license that made her the youngest licensed radio operator in Florida history. But the real gift was his announcement that he was officially nomming her his successor as Serenity's emergency response captain. "Age isn't what makes a good sailor," he explained to the gathered crowd of marina workers and yacht owners. "Preparation, dedication, and respect for the sea make good sailors. Brinley has all three in abundance." The transformation in Brinley over the following months was remarkable to witness. The shy, curious kid who'd arrived for summer vacation had become a confident young woman with a clear sense of purpose. She threw herself into studying marine engineering with the same intensity she'd once applied to documenting yacht specifications. When she returned to Ohio at the end of summer, she wasn't the same person who'd left. Her mother Cordelia told me that Brinley had gained confidence that extended far beyond maritime operations. She started speaking up in class, joined her school's engineering club, and began teaching other kids about boat safety and weather awareness. But the most meaningful change was in how she viewed challenges. The girl who'd once been intimidated by her parents' divorce now approached problems with the same methodical preparation she'd applied to learning Serenity's systems. She understood that knowledge combined with careful planning could overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. 3 years later, Brinley is 16 and already accepted to 3 different maritime academies. She still spends her summers with me at Paradise Harbor, but now she's teaching other kids the lessons Captain Thorne taught her. Her notebook has evolved into a comprehensive manual that young sailors throughout South Florida use to learn emergency procedures. Every time I watch her explain weather patterns to a new group of students, or see her patiently teaching rope work to younger children, I'm reminded of that night when Hurricane Celeste tried to destroy everything we cared about. Brinley didn't save just a superyacht that night. She saved an entire marina, protected countless lives along the shoreline, and proved that heroes don't always look the way we expect them to. The $200 million superyacht was impressive, but the 8-year-old girl who refused to abandon it was priceless. Sometimes the smallest person in the room has the biggest heart and the clearest vision of what needs to be done. Brinley taught me that courage isn't about being fearless. It's about being prepared, staying calm, and never giving up on the people counting on you. That lesson is worth more than all the superyachts in the world.